My mother-in-law looked me straight in the eyes at my engagement party and said, "You'll never truly be part of this family." She raised her champagne glass with a smug smile, completely unaware that I already owned the mortgage to their sprawling family estate, and with one signature, I could make them all homeless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Harrington family estate was an architectural marvel nestled in the countryside just outside of Boston. Sprawling gardens, a winding driveway lined with century-old oak trees, and the imposing three-story Victorian mansion that had been in the family for generations, as my fiancé Blake's mother, Victoria Harrington, never tired of reminding me. I stood in the grand ballroom, crystal champagne flute in hand, trying to look like I belonged among Boston's elite. The engagement party was in full swing, a lavish affair with nearly 200 guests, a string quartet in the corner, waiters in pristine white gloves carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, and enough champagne to fill a small swimming pool. This wasn't my world. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Providence, raised by a single father who worked 60-hour weeks as an investment advisor to put me through college. But looking at me now in my designer dress and carefully styled hair, no one would guess my background. No one except Victoria Harrington. She glided through the crowd like royalty, her silver blonde hair twisted into an elegant updo, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. When Blake had first introduced us 6 months ago, her smile hadn't reached her eyes. "Eliza Bennett? I don't believe I know any Bennetts in our circle," she'd said, her tone suggesting that was precisely the problem. Blake squeezed my hand now, as we accepted congratulations from yet another couple whose names I'd already forgotten. "They love you," he whispered in my ear, his breath warm against my skin. I smiled up at him, this man who had swept into my life like a hurricane. Blake. Harrington, handsome, charming, and heir to one of the oldest financial institutions in New England. We'd met at a charity auction where I was representing my investment firm. He'd bid an obscene amount on a weekend getaway package, then immediately asked me to join him. I'd said no, intrigued but cautious. He'd persisted. 3 months later, he proposed. "Your mother doesn't," I whispered back, keeping my smile firmly in place for the benefit of onlookers. "She's just protective," he said, the same explanation he'd given me countless times before. "She'll come around." Blake was brilliant with numbers and strategy, but he was blind when it came to his mother. Victoria Harrington had no intention of coming around. In her eyes, I was an outsider, a gold digger who had somehow ensnared her precious son. What Blake didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was far more than the junior investment advisor I claimed to be. "Darling, could I borrow you for a moment?" Victoria appeared at Blake's side, touching his arm possessively. "The Whitakers want to discuss that donation to your father's campaign." Blake looked at me apologetically. 5 minutes? "Take your time," I said, watching as Victoria steered him away, not even bothering to acknowledge me. I took the opportunity to slip out onto the terrace, needing a moment away from the stifling politeness and scrutiny. The night air was cool against my skin, the garden below illuminated by strategically placed lights that highlighted the sculptured hedges and marble fountains. It won't last, you know. I turned to find Victoria standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from inside. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stone terrace. "Excuse me?" I kept my voice neutral, though my heart had begun to race. "This engagement, this fantasy you've concocted." She waved her hand dismissively. "Blake has always had a weakness for novelty, but he'll tire of you as he has with all the others. The Harringtons marry their own kind." I took a slow sip of champagne, using the moment to compose myself. "And what kind is that exactly? People with breeding, heritage, connections." Her smile was sharp, predatory. People who understand our world and its obligations. People like the Prestons or the Callaways. I named two families whose daughters Blake had previously dated, both from impeccable backgrounds, both now married to other men. A flash of irritation crossed her face. Those were unfortunate mismatches, but at least they understood what it means to be part of a legacy like ours. And you don't think I do? Victoria laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. My dear, you've done an admirable job of polishing yourself. But at the end of the day, you'll never truly be part of this family. The words were designed to wound, to make me question my place beside Blake. If I'd been the person Victoria thought I was, an ambitious social climber who'd gotten lucky, perhaps they would have. Instead, I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same one I experienced when making a particularly high-stakes investment decision. That's where you're wrong, Victoria, I said quietly. Her eyebrows rose slightly, surprised by my lack of deference. Am I? Tell me, what exactly do you bring to this union besides an attractive face? The Harringtons have built their reputation over generations. Our connections, our influence. These aren't things you can acquire overnight. There are many kinds of influence, I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Let me be perfectly clear. If you proceed with this marriage, I will make sure your life in this family is difficult. Blake may be infatuated now, but blood is thicker than water. He will always choose us. I smiled then, a real smile that seemed to unsettle her more than any angry retort. I appreciate your candor, Victoria. It's good to know exactly where we stand. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by the smooth confidence of a woman who had never lost a battle of wills. I'm glad we understand each other. Before she could say more, Blake appeared in the doorway. There you are. Mom, Dad's looking for you. Something about the toast? Victoria's demeanor transformed instantly. Of course, darling. We wouldn't want to keep everyone waiting. She touched his cheek affectionately, then glanced back at me. Remember what I said, Eliza. As she glided back inside, Blake joined me at the balustrade. Everything okay? You look intense. I leaned into him, inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne. Just getting some advice from your mother on being a Harrington. He chuckled, oblivious to the undercurrents. Good luck with that. Took me 30 years and I'm still learning. He pressed a kiss to my temple. Ready to go back in? Dad's about to give his speech. I nodded, letting him lead me back inside, where chandeliers cast a golden glow over the assembled guests. Edward Harrington, Blake's father, and the current CEO of Harrington Financial Group stood at the center of the room, commanding attention without raising his voice. Friends, family, distinguished guests, we are delighted to welcome you to celebrate the engagement of our son Blake to Eliza Bennett. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I felt Victoria's eyes on me as Edward continued, extolling Blake's accomplishments and expressing carefully worded optimism about our future together. What struck me was the absence of any specific mention of me, beyond my name. No mention of my career, my education, or what I might bring to the family. To Edward Harrington, like his wife, I was simply the woman who had somehow captured his son's attention. If only they knew. As Blake's father raised his glass in a toast, I caught Victoria whispering to an elegant older woman beside her, both of them glancing in my direction with barely concealed disdain. The woman, Blake's Aunt Henrietta, I later learned, shook her head slightly, her expression one of resigned disapproval. They thought they knew everything about me. They'd had me investigated, of course. Victoria had hinted as much during one of our earlier encounters. We make it a point to know who's entering our circle, she'd said. But their investigation had uncovered exactly what I'd wanted them to find. Eliza Bennett, 29, Graduated cum laude from Brown University, worked for Blackwell Investments for 5 years. Modest family background, no scandals, no excessive debt. Nothing remarkable in either direction. What they hadn't found was far more interesting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that evening, as the party wound down and the last guests departed with air kisses and promises to meet for lunch, Blake's parents cornered us in the main hall. "We were thinking you might want to consider a June wedding," Victoria said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "The Harrington women have traditionally married in June for the past 3 generations. "Actually," Blake interjected, his arm around my waist, "we were thinking September. Eliza loves the fall colors." Victoria's smile tightened. "June is much more practical for the kind of event we'll be hosting. Wouldn't you agree, Edward?" Edward Harrington, a tall man with Blake's jawline and calculating eyes, nodded absently. "Your mother has already spoken with the event coordinator at the club. June would be ideal." I felt Blake tense beside me. "We haven't even discussed venues yet. The country club is the only suitable location," Victoria interrupted. "We've held all significant family events there for decades." I placed my hand on Blake's arm, feeling the subtle shift in his posture. He hated confrontation, especially with his parents. "Perhaps we could discuss this tomorrow. It's been a long evening." Edward checked his watch, an antique Patek Philippe that had belonged to his father. "Yes, it's getting late. Blake, don't forget we have that meeting with the Sumner Group at 10 tomorrow." Blake nodded, dutiful son that he was. "I'll be there," her voice honeyed with false concern. "I only want what's best for Blake." "Of course," I replied, "and so do I." "Good." She patted my hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Then you understand that certain traditions and expectations come with the Harrington name. Blake might fancy himself independent, but he knows his responsibilities." I looked up at the portrait she'd indicated. 4 generations of Harringtons posed in this very house, their expressions serious and entitled. "It's an impressive legacy." "Yes, it is," she said, pride evident in her voice. "One that we've maintained through careful stewardship and selective associations." The implication was clear. In Victoria's mind, I was a temporary distraction. A phase Blake would outgrow when the reality of his position and responsibilities fully registered. She had no idea that I understood power and legacy better than she could imagine. As Blake and I drove back to my apartment in his sleek Audi, he apologized for his mother's behavior. "She's from a different era," he said, his hand resting on my knee. "Once we're married, she'll have to accept you." I smiled in the darkness of the car, watching the city lights blur past. "Don't worry about me. I can handle Victoria." "That's what I love about you," he said, squeezing my knee. "Most women would be intimidated, but you're different." Different, indeed. As Blake focused on the road ahead, I thought about the documents. Locked in my home safe, papers that outlined exactly how precarious the mighty Harrington dynasty actually was. Papers that showed how deeply in debt Edward Harrington had become, trying to maintain the illusion of old money prosperity. Papers that revealed the Harrington estate, that symbol of generational wealth, was mortgaged to the hilt. A mortgage now owned, through a series of shell companies, by me. Victoria had declared I would never be part of the family. She had no idea how wrong she was. I wasn't just marrying into the Harrington family. I already controlled their most precious possession. The game was just beginning, and Victoria had no idea who she was really playing against. I never set out to own the Harrington family mortgage. In fact, I never intended to cross paths with any of Boston's elite families. Life has a strange way of circling back on itself, and the threads of my past were about to become inextricably tangled with the Harringtons' future. My father, Richard Bennett, wasn't just any investment advisor. Before his business collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis, he had been a respected financial strategist who managed portfolios for several prestigious clients, including, ironically, Edward Harrington's father, the late William Harrington. What the world saw was my father's downfall, his firm shuttering, our comfortable lifestyle evaporating overnight, and our forced move from a luxurious condo to a modest two-bedroom apartment. What they didn't see was that my father had predicted the crash months before it happened. He had warned his clients, including William Harrington, to diversify and protect their assets. William listened. Edward, who had recently taken over the family business, did not. "Never put all your faith in traditional institutions, Eliza," my father told me during those difficult days as he painstakingly rebuilt his career from scratch. "The people who survive are the ones who see the whole board, not just the pieces, in front of them." I took that lesson to heart. While completing my business degree at Brown, I worked 2 jobs and saved every penny. When I graduated, instead of accepting offers from prestigious firms, I started small, building a network of my own. By day, I was Eliza Bennett, junior investment advisor at Blackwell Investments. By night, I ran a private consulting firm under a different name, specializing in identifying distressed assets before anyone else noticed their potential. 3 years ago, I began tracking patterns in the real estate holdings of several old Boston families. The Harringtons caught my attention when they quietly refinanced their estate for the 3rd time in 5 years. Public records showed a pattern of increasing debt, carefully concealed behind a facade of prosperity. The family that had once owned half of Boston's financial district was slowly drowning. I didn't know then that I would meet Blake Harrington at a charity auction. I didn't know that his easy smile and genuine interest in my opinions, so different from his family's later coldness, would capture my heart. I certainly didn't know that I would fall in love with him. But I did know that the Harrington estate's mortgage had been bundled with several other high-value properties and sold to a foreign investment group looking to offload their American assets. And I knew that with the right financing and timing, I could acquire it. It took 8 months of careful negotiation, leveraging contacts across 3 continents, and nearly every cent of capital I had accumulated. But 6 months before meeting Blake, in a twist of fate that still amazes me, I became the majority stakeholder in the company that held the mortgage to the Harrington family estate. The morning after our engagement party, I sat in my office, at Blackwell Investments, reviewing quarterly reports while my mind kept drifting back to Victoria's cutting words. My assistant, Natalie, knocked lightly on my door. "Your 10 o'clock is here," she said, ushering in Diane Reynolds, my attorney, and the only person who knew the full extent of my financial maneuvers. "Congratulations are in order, I hear," Diane said when we were alone, setting her leather portfolio on my desk. Tall, with cropped silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, Diane had been my father's attorney before becoming mine. "Your engagement made the society pages." I grimaced. "Along with speculation about what Blake Harrington sees in a newcomer from Providence," I quoted from one particularly snobbish column. Diane laughed. "If they only knew." She withdrew a folder from her portfolio. "I've brought the quarterly reports on your holdings, including the Harrington property." I flipped through the documents, noting the figures with satisfaction. "The interest payments have been late twice now." 3 times, Diane corrected, pointing to a line item. "This came in yesterday, 5 days past due. Not enough to trigger default clauses, but a pattern is emerging." I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. "Edward Harrington is struggling more than I thought. The question remains," Diane said carefully, "what do you intend to do with this leverage? Now that you're engaged to their son, the situation has complications." It was a fair question. When I'd acquired the mortgage, it had been a business decision, not a personal one. Now it had become both. I have no intention of foreclosing, I said firmly. Despite what his family might think of me, I love Blake. But, Diane prompted, knowing me too well. But I won't be bullied or dismissed by Victoria Harrington either. I closed the folder. For now, we maintain course. I want regular updates on their payment schedule and any changes to the family's financial status. Diane nodded, making a note. And the engagement? How's the future groom taking his mother's obvious disapproval? I sighed, thinking of Blake's unwavering optimism. He thinks she'll come around once we're married. He doesn't see how deep her prejudices run. Will you tell him about the mortgage? It was the question I'd been asking myself since our relationship had become serious. Not yet, I decided. Blake adores his parents, especially his mother. Learning that his father has mismanaged the family finances to this extent would devastate him. And learning that I've known all along. Might make him question your motives, Diane finished. Fair enough, but secrets have a way of surfacing. Eliza, especially in marriages. After Diane left, I stood by my office window, watching Boston's financial district bustle below. My phone buzzed with a text from Blake. Lunch today? I've missed you. Promise not to talk about June versus September weddings. I smiled despite myself. Blake was the unexpected variable in my carefully constructed equation, the genuine warmth in a family built on cold calculation. I texted back agreeing to meet him, then turned to my computer. With a few keystrokes, I accessed the secure server where I tracked my private investments. The Harrington estate mortgage was just one element in a complex web of assets I'd acquired. Many of Boston's elite would be shocked to learn that the quiet advisor they barely noticed at social functions held significant leverage over their financial futures. But Victoria Harrington had made this personal. You'll never truly be part of this family, she'd said, looking down at me from her perceived height of social superiority. Little did she know that her family's continued occupation of their ancestral home depended entirely on my goodwill. I had no desire to destroy the Harringtons, but I would not be treated as an outsider, a gold digger, or a temporary inconvenience. Victoria had drawn the battle lines. Now I would show her exactly who she was dealing with. The question was how to proceed without hurting Blake in the process. He remained blissfully unaware of his family's financial precariousness and of my true financial position. In his mind, I was a hard-working investment advisor who lived comfortably but modestly. He loved that I wasn't impressed by his family, name, or wealth, ironically the very qualities that made Victoria distrust me. My intercom buzzed. Ms. Bennett? Mr. Harrington is on line 1. For a moment, I thought it might be Blake, calling to confirm our lunch plans, but the formal announcement suggested otherwise. This is Eliza Bennett, I answered, keeping my tone professional. Ms. Bennett. Edward Harrington's deep voice filled the line. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Mr. Harrington. What can I do for you? My pulse quickened slightly, wondering if somehow he had discovered my connection to their mortgage. I was hoping we might have lunch this week, he said smoothly, without Blake or Victoria, just the two of us. I kept my surprise from showing in my voice. Of course. May I ask what this is regarding? There was a brief pause. Let's just say I'd like to get to know my future daughter-in-law better. How about tomorrow at Le Méridien, noon? I'll be there, I agreed, curiosity piqued. After hanging up, I sat motionless, mind racing. What did Edward want? Had he discovered something about me? Or was this simply an attempt to evaluate me more thoroughly as Blake's chosen partner? Whatever his game, I would be prepared. Unlike Victoria, who wielded her social status like a weapon, Edward was more subtle, more strategic. He hadn't built the Harrington Financial Group into what it was by being obvious in his tactics. As I prepared to meet Blake for lunch, I reviewed what I knew about Edward Harrington. Behind his polished exterior and impeccable pedigree lurked a ruthless businessman who had expanded the family empire through a series of aggressive acquisitions in the 90s and early 2000s. But the financial crisis had hit them harder than they publicly admitted, and Edward's attempts to recover had led to increasingly risky investments. The Harrington estate wasn't just a symbol of their status. It was one of the few tangible assets they had left that wasn't leveraged against business loans or tied up in illiquid investments. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria's dismissal of my worthiness was based on a fortune that no longer existed as she imagined it. The Harrington legacy she so fiercely defended was built on an increasingly unstable foundation. And I, the outsider she disdained, might be the only person who could save it, if I chose to. Le Méridien was exactly the kind of restaurant where I'd expect to find Edward Harrington, exclusive, discreet, with private dining alcoves for conversations that required privacy. The maitre d' recognized him immediately, ushering us to a corner table partially concealed by an ornate screen and lush potted plants. "Ms. Bennet," Edward said as we settled in, his smile perfectly calibrated, friendly without being warm. "Thank you for making time in your schedule." "I was intrigued by your invitation," I replied honestly, accepting the menu from the hovering server. Edward ordered a bottle of wine without consulting me, a presumptuous gesture that revealed much about how he viewed our relative positions. I waited until the sommelier had poured and departed before meeting his gaze directly. "So, Mr. Harrington, what did you want to discuss?" He took a measured sip of his wine. "Straight to the point. I appreciate that quality in business, in personal matters too." He set his glass down precisely. "Let's be frank, Eliza. May I call you Eliza?" I nodded, watching him carefully. Blake has always been impulsive, passionate. He makes decisions with his heart rather than his head. Edward's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, assessing my reaction. It's an admirable quality, in many ways, but sometimes leads to complications. "By complications, you mean me?" I said evenly. A flicker of appreciation crossed his face. Direct indeed. "Yes, in this instance, you are the complication. Not because there's anything wrong with you personally. Your background is respectable enough, your career trajectory promising. But you must understand that the Harrington name carries certain expectations. Your wife made those expectations quite clear at our engagement party." Edward winced slightly. "Victoria can be traditional in her views, but her concerns aren't entirely without merit." He leaned forward. "Our family has spent generations building relationships, alliances, networks of influence. Marriage, in our circle, isn't just about love. It's about strengthening those connections." I maintained my composure, though internally I marveled at his audacity. Here was a man whose financial empire was crumbling beneath him, lecturing me about the importance of strategic alliances. "And you don't believe I bring value to these networks," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "On the contrary, I've looked into your work at Blackwell. You're quite talented." He paused as our first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops. But talent isn't the issue here. Integration is. Victoria fears, and I share some of her concern, that Blake hasn't fully considered what bringing an outsider into our world entails. I took a bite of my scallop, giving myself a moment to formulate my response. "And what does it entail exactly?" "Discretion, loyalty, understanding that family interests sometimes supersede personal preferences." Edward cut his food with precise movements. The Harrington name opens doors, but it also comes with responsibilities. "To preserve the legacy," I supplied. "Precisely." He seemed pleased that I understood. "Blake has certain obligations that he can't simply ignore because he's fallen in love." I raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" His role in the family business, for one. His position in certain social circles. His future children's education and integration into those same circles. Edward's gaze was steady. And of course, there's the estate. My pulse quickened slightly. The estate? The Harrington estate? Has been in our family for 5 generations. Blake will inherit it someday, along with all the responsibilities that entails. He gave a small, practiced sigh. Victoria is particularly attached to the idea of our grandchildren growing up there, as Blake did. I wondered if Edward had any idea how close they were to losing that precious estate. His confidence suggested not. It sounds like you and Victoria have already planned out Blake's entire future, I observed. Not planned exactly. We simply understand what's at stake. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you? The question hung between us, weighted with implication. I met his gaze without flinching. I believe I understand more than you give me credit for, Mr. Harrington. Something in my tone must have alerted him. His expression shifted, becoming more calculating. I make it a point to thoroughly research anyone who enters our family's orbit. Your background is interesting. Is it? I kept my voice light. Your father's firm collapsed quite suddenly during the financial crisis. A dramatic fall from grace. I felt a flare of anger but kept it carefully contained. Many firms did. It was a difficult time. Indeed. Yet he managed to rebuild in a smaller capacity. Admirable. Edward took another sip of wine. You've done well for yourself too, though there are certain gaps in your financial history that my team found curious. So he had been investigating me, more thoroughly than I'd anticipated. I maintained my calm exterior while mentally cataloging what he might have discovered. My shell companies were well protected, my ownership of his mortgage hidden behind layers of corporate entities. But Edward hadn't built his business without developing an instinct for financial irregularities. Financial privacy is important to me, I said simply. A value I learned from my father. Privacy, Edward repeated, his tone suggesting he found the concept questionable. In my experience, people who value privacy excessively often have something to hide. Or perhaps they've had their privacy violated in the past and are determined not to let it happen again. I set down my fork. My father was unfairly vilified after the crash. Reporters camped outside our apartment. Former friends suddenly couldn't remember his name. It was an education in how quickly people can turn on you when circumstances change. Edward studied me as if seeing me in a new light. You're protective of him. Wouldn't you be protective of someone who sacrificed everything to ensure you had opportunities? A hint of genuine respect flickered in his eyes. Fair point. He sat back. Let me be direct, Eliza. I'm not opposed to your marriage to Blake. But I do have concerns about how you'll fit into our world. And what would alleviate those concerns? A demonstration of your commitment to the Harrington legacy. He spoke casually, but I could sense the calculation behind his words. Perhaps a prenuptial agreement to protect certain family assets. Perhaps your involvement in some of our charitable foundations to help integrate you into the right circles before the wedding. And there it was. The real purpose of this lunch. Edward wasn't trying to scare me away, he was trying to control me, to establish the power dynamic early. Victoria wanted me gone. Edward wanted me neutralized and assimilated. I see, I said, keeping my voice level. And if I were to decline these suggestions? Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then I'm afraid Victoria's concerns would seem more justified. Blake values our opinion, Eliza. He always has. The threat was thinly veiled. Accept our terms, or we'll turn Blake against you. I wondered if Blake knew his parents were having this conversation with me. Somehow, I doubted it. I'll consider your suggestions, I said, non-committal. That's all I ask. Edward signaled, for the check. I hope you understand, this is about protecting our family's interests. Of course, I replied. Family is everything. As I walked back to my office after lunch, my mind was racing. Edward's intervention confirmed what I'd suspected. The Harringtons saw me as a threat to be neutralized rather than a person to be welcomed. Victoria's approach was emotional manipulation. Edward's was financial control. Neither of them realized they were playing a game whose rules I had already rewritten. That evening, Blake called, his voice tense. My mother's planning a dinner next week. She wants to properly welcome you to the family. I almost laughed at the transparent ploy. That sounds nice. It won't be, Blake warned. She's invited. My aunts, my grandmother, all the family matriarchs. It's basically an inquisition disguised as a dinner party. I can handle your mother, I assured him. That's what worries me, he said with a sigh. When you two are in the same room, it feels like watching a chess match where I can't see the board. He was more perceptive than his parents gave him credit for. Do you want me to decline? No, he said after a moment. No, I want you there. I want them to see what I see in you. His faith in me sent a pang of guilt through my chest. How would he react when he learned the truth about his family's finances and about my role in them? The next morning, I received an email that confirmed my suspicions about Edward's true financial situation. One of my contacts at a major bank forwarded me a notice. Harrington Financial Group had been quietly shopping for new investors. Their last quarterly report showed significant losses, carefully hidden in the footnotes and technical language. The facade was beginning to crack. Edward's talk of legacy and tradition masked a desperate scramble to shore up a crumbling financial position. His insistence on a prenup wasn't just about controlling me. It was about protecting what little they had left from potential creditors. I forwarded the information to Diane with a simple note. Monitor closely. I need to know if they start liquidating assets. Her response came within the hour. Already happening. 3 pieces from their art collection were sold at a private auction last week, officially listed as rebalancing the portfolio. Unofficially, they needed the cash. So it was worse than I thought. The mighty Harringtons were selling family treasures to maintain appearances. Victoria's sharp words about my background seemed especially ironic now. Her family's vaunted wealth was increasingly an illusion, while mine, though carefully concealed, was very real. As I prepared for Victoria's dinner party, I made a decision. I wouldn't reveal my hand yet, but I would no longer pretend to be intimidated. The Harringtons had declared war the moment Victoria looked me in the eye and told me I'd never be part of their family. Now it was time to let them know they were facing an opponent worth respecting. Victoria Harrington's dining room could have been featured in Architectural Digest. The table, set for 12, gleamed with antique silver and crystal that had allegedly been in the family for generations. I wondered idly how much of it would soon end up in the hands of private collectors as the family quietly sold off assets. I had dressed strategically for the evening, a navy blue dress that was elegant without being flashy, pearl earrings that suggested old money rather than new. My hair swept into a classic updo. The goal wasn't to impress Victoria, an impossible task, but to give her nothing obvious to criticize. Eliza, darling. Victoria air-kissed my cheeks when Blake and I arrived, her smile as artificial as the flower arrangement centerpiece. How lovely you look. Almost traditional. The slight emphasis conveyed her surprise, as if she'd expected me to arrive in something inappropriate. Thank you, Victoria. Your home is beautiful, as always. I matched her tone precisely. Polite, distant, with just enough warmth to pass for sincerity. Blake squeezed my hand encouragingly as Victoria led us into the drawing room where the other guests were gathered. I recognized a few faces from our engagement party. Blake's Aunt Henrietta, his father's sister, whose perpetually pinched expression suggested chronic disapproval. His grandmother Eleanor, the family matriarch, watching everyone with sharp eyes that belied her 83 years, and several cousins whose names I'd memorized from family photographs. "Everyone," Victoria announced. "You remember Blake's fiancée, Eliza Bennett." The resulting murmurs of greeting varied from barely polite to genuinely curious. I felt their collective assessment, the outsider who had somehow captured Blake Harrington, their golden boy. "So, Eliza," Aunt Henrietta began almost immediately, "Victoria tells me you're in finance. How interesting. Women weren't in those roles in my day." "The industry has evolved," I replied smoothly, though not as quickly as one might hope. "And your family?" Eleanor Harrington asked, her voice carrying the distinctive Boston Brahmin accent that had mostly faded from younger generations. "Bennett, was it? I don't recall any Bennetts in our circle." "My family is from Providence originally," I said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. "Ah, Providence." The way she said it made the city sound like a particularly undesirable suburb. "And what did your father do there?" Blake tensed beside me, but I placed a calming hand on his arm. "My father was an investment advisor. He managed portfolios for several notable clients." "Was." Eleanor caught the past tense immediately. "He still consults, but on a smaller scale now." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Eliza's father experienced some setbacks during the financial crisis." The way she phrased it made it sound as if my father had been personally responsible for the global economic collapse. I felt a flash of anger, but channeled it into a calm smile. "Many did," I replied, "including some of Boston's oldest institutions. Adaptation is essential for survival in finance." Edward, who had been quietly observing from near the fireplace, raised his eyebrows slightly at this. He knew exactly which old institutions I was referencing, including his own. Dinner proved to be the anticipated inquisition, with questions about my education, my career aspirations, my views on everything from politics to child-rearing. Each question came wrapped in politeness, but carried an undercurrent of judgment. "And where do you see yourself in 5 years, Eliza?" Henrietta asked over the main course. "Still working, I presume? Though, of course, once children arrive." "I intend to continue my career," I said firmly. "I believe in setting an example of professional dedication." "How modern," Victoria murmured, in a tone that suggested this was not a compliment. "Though the Harrington wives have traditionally focused on family and philanthropy. It's quite a demanding role, managing the social obligations alone." "I'm sure Eliza will find her own way to contribute," Blake interjected, his patience visibly wearing thin. "She's already involved with several charitable organizations." "Yes, but Harrington women typically chair the boards of certain specific charities," Victoria countered. "There are expectations, Blake. Perhaps it's time for new perspectives." "On those expectations," I suggested mildly. "After all, even the most established traditions occasionally benefit from fresh approaches." Eleanor's shrewd gaze fixed on me. "You speak of change as if it's inherently valuable, young woman. Some things endure for a reason." "I agree," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. "Value endures. Superficial trappings often don't." A momentary silence fell over the table. I had come dangerously close to suggesting that the Harrington traditions might be among those superficial trappings. Edward cleared his throat. "Eliza makes an interesting point. Adaptation has always been key to the Harrington success. We've survived by recognizing when to hold firm and when to evolve." His intervention surprised me. Was he actually supporting my position, or simply trying to diffuse tension? "Speaking of evolution," I said, seizing the opening, "I've been reading about the changing landscape in Boston's financial sector. Some fascinating developments." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. such as the shift in investment patterns, particularly among older firms. There seems to be a move toward liquidating traditional holdings in favor of more immediate assets. Victoria looked confused, but Edward understood perfectly. I was referencing the very sales his family had been quietly executing. Market fluctuations often necessitate portfolio adjustments, he said carefully. Nothing concerning there. Of course not, I agreed. Though I've always found it interesting how institutions can appear robust while facing significant internal pressures. Perception versus reality. Blake glanced between his father and me, sensing an undercurrent he didn't fully understand. Are we still talking about finance, or has this become a philosophy discussion? Both, perhaps, I smiled at him. The line between them is often thinner than we pretend. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but I could feel Edward watching me with new wariness. I had shown my hand just enough to let him know I wasn't as naive as he might have hoped. After dinner, as the group moved back to the drawing room, for coffee and dessert, Victoria orchestrated a moment alone with me, steering me toward a display of family photographs. Blake is a child, she said, indicating a photo of a grinning boy on a sailboat. We've spent summers on Cape Cod since he was born, another family tradition. He looks happy, I observed genuinely. Blake's smile hadn't changed, still open, still genuine. He was, Victoria said, her voice softening momentarily before hardening again. The Harrington legacy has given him a charmed life, security, connections, purpose. I turned to face her directly. Is this where you tell me again that I'm threatening that legacy? Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Direct, aren't you? Perhaps not entirely without merit. She straightened a frame unnecessarily. I've been watching you. Tonight, Eliza. You're intelligent, I'll grant you that. Poised. But you don't belong in our world. Yet here I am, I replied calmly. For now. Victoria's smile was cold. Blake has always had a rebellious streak. Dating outside our circle is his way of asserting independence, but eventually he'll remember who he is and what's expected of him. You underestimate your son if you think his love is so shallow. And you underestimate the power of heritage if you think your relationship can withstand its pull. She leaned slightly closer. We're not just a family, Eliza. We're an institution. Blake knows deep down that continuing our legacy is his primary responsibility. Perhaps he's redefining what that legacy means. Victoria's laugh was soft, but cutting. How charmingly naive. The Harrington name has stood for excellence and tradition for over a century. That doesn't change because my son has fallen for a girl from Providence. The dismissive way she said girl from Providence ignited something in me. All evening, I had maintained perfect composure, absorbed their veiled insults with a smile. But Victoria's certainty, her absolute conviction in her family's untouchable status, when I knew just how precarious that status truly was, finally broke through my restraint. You know what I find fascinating, Victoria? I kept my voice low, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. The absolute confidence with which you speak of the Harrington legacy, as if it's impervious to outside forces. Her eyes narrowed. It has endured for generations. And yet, I continued, legacies are fragile things. They can crumble surprisingly quickly when their foundations are compromised. What exactly are you implying? A hint of uncertainty had crept into her voice. Simply that appearances and reality don't always align. The most imposing facades can hide structural weaknesses. I glanced pointedly around the grand room with its priceless artwork and antiques. I wonder how many more pieces will quietly disappear before anyone notices they're gone. Victoria went very still. I don't know what you think you know. I know enough, I interrupted gently. More than you might be comfortable with. For the first time since I'd met her, Victoria Harrington looked genuinely unsettled. Before she could respond, Blake appeared at my side. "Everything okay here?" he asked, glancing between us. "Perfectly fine," Victoria recovered quickly. "I was just sharing some family history with Eliza." "Ancient history, I hope," Blake said lightly. "Dad's breaking out the good brandy, Mom. You might want to supervise before he gets too generous with grandfather's collection." Victoria nodded stiffly and moved away, but not before giving me one last measured look, reassessing, recalculating. "What was that about?" Blake asked when she was out of earshot. "You two looked intense." I smiled, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Just getting to know my future mother-in-law better." Later that night, as Blake drove us back to my apartment, he seemed preoccupied. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said finally. "They can be overwhelming." "I expected nothing less," I assured him. "Your family is protective of you. I understand that." He frowned. "It's more than protection. Sometimes I think they see me as an extension of the Harrington name rather than as Blake." I studied his profile in the dim light. "Do you ever resent it? The expectations, the legacy?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Don't get me wrong. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had. But occasionally I wonder what it would be like to build something entirely my own, without the Harrington shadow looming over it." His words touched something in me. Blake wasn't blind to his family's controlling nature. He simply managed it differently than I would. Where I confronted, he accommodated, finding spaces for himself within the constraints they imposed. "What would you do?" I asked. "If you could start fresh, without expectations?" He laughed softly. "Open a small investment firm focused on sustainable businesses. Something with purpose beyond just accumulating wealth." He glanced at me. "Sounds naive, doesn't it?" "Not at all," I said. "It sounds like you." When we reached my apartment, he turned to me with serious eyes. "They didn't scare you off, did they?" I leaned over and kissed him gently. It would take more than one uncomfortable dinner to chase me away. What I didn't tell him was that the evening had only strengthened my resolve. Victoria and Edward Harrington were so convinced of their superiority, so certain of their right to dictate terms, that they couldn't conceive of anyone outmaneuvering them. Their blindness was my advantage. Victoria had declared I would never be part of the family, believing her word was law. She didn't realize that I already held the keys to her kingdom. And soon, very soon, she would discover just how precarious her throne had become. The morning after Victoria's dinner party, my phone rang as I was reviewing client portfolios. Diane's name flashed on the screen. "You'll want to see this," she said without preamble. "I'm sending it to your secure server now." I switched to my encrypted laptop and opened the file she'd sent. A detailed analysis of Harrington Financial Group's latest quarterly filings, along with notes from several private banking sources. The picture it painted was worse than I'd anticipated. "They're underwater on several major investments," Diane explained as I scanned the documents. "The European expansion Edward launched last year is hemorrhaging money, and they've leveraged nearly everything to keep it afloat." "Including the estate," I noted, seeing the updated mortgage information. "They've taken a third equity line against it in 8 months. Not just that. Look at page 7. I flipped to the indicated page and felt my breath catch. Edward. Harrington had pledged his shares in the company's core business as collateral for a high-interest loan from a notorious private equity firm known for hostile takeovers. "He's risking everything," I murmured. "And no one outside the family knows. They're maintaining the illusion perfectly. Charity galas, political donations, all the trappings of old money security. But it's a house of cards, Eliza. One strong. Wind, and it all comes down." I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. Does Blake know? Doubtful. From what we've gathered, Edwards kept the extent of the trouble hidden from everyone except possibly Victoria. Even the board has only seen carefully sanitized reports. After ending the call with Diane, I sat motionless, thinking. The Harringtons weren't just facing financial difficulty. They were on the brink of collapse, and Edward's desperate maneuvers were only accelerating the inevitable. The man who had condescendingly lectured me about family responsibility was gambling with his family's entire future. And Blake, my Blake, with his dreams of sustainable investing and genuine value creation, had no idea he was about to inherit a legacy built on sand. My intercom buzzed. "Ms. Bennett, Mr. Blake Harrington is here to see you." I quickly closed my laptop. "Send him in." Blake entered with a bouquet of lilies, my favorite, and a tired smile. "Surprise," he said, bending to kiss me. "I was in the neighborhood for a meeting and thought I'd kidnap you for lunch." "Perfect timing," I said, accepting the flowers. "I was just thinking about you." He dropped into the chair across from my desk with a sigh. "Thinking about how you can still back out of this engagement after meeting the full Harrington Inquisition." "Squad?" I laughed, despite my churning thoughts. It would take more than one uncomfortable dinner to scare me off. Besides, I thought your grandmother rather liked me. "Grandmother Eleanor likes anyone who stands their ground with Mother," Blake said wryly. "She complains constantly about how Victoria runs the family, but then sits back and watches like it's a spectator sport." I arranged the lilies in a vase, buying myself time to decide how much to probe. "Speaking of running things, how involved are you in the day-to-day operations at Harrington Financial?" He shrugged. "I handle client relationships mostly. Some product development. Dad keeps the financial side close to his chest." A shadow crossed his face. "He's always been that way, secretive about the numbers. Says I need to learn the human side of the business first." "Or he's keeping you in the dark because he knows you'd question his decisions," I thought, but didn't say. "Any particular reason you're asking?" Blake looked curious rather than suspicious. I kept my tone casual. "Just wondering about the family. Business I'll be marrying into. After all, it'll be yours someday." "God, don't remind me." He ran a hand through his hair. "Sometimes I think Dad expects me to be a carbon copy of him, ready to step into his shoes the moment he decides to step back. But we have completely different approaches to business." "How so?" "He's all about expansion, acquisition, beating the competition. I keep telling him we should be focusing on client retention, ethical investing options, modernizing our image." Blake shook his head. He nods and smiles, and then goes right back to doing things the way they've always been. Done. The irony was painful. Blake was advocating for exactly the kind of strategy that might save the company, while Edward pursued the high-risk maneuvers that were destroying it. "Have you ever thought about starting your own firm?" I asked, thinking of his comment in the car. "Something that reflects your values?" His expression turned wistful. "All the time. But there's the family legacy to consider. 5 generations of Harringtons have run the company. I can't be the one who walks away from that." I studied him, this good, honorable man caught in a web of expectations and tradition. "Even if staying means compromising your vision?" "It's complicated," he said after a moment. "There's what I want, and then there's what I owe to my family name." I wanted to tell him then about his father's precarious financial gambles, about the mortgage I controlled, about how the legacy he felt duty-bound to protect was already crumbling beneath his feet. But looking at his face, I couldn't bring myself to shatter his world. Not yet, not until I had a clear plan for what came next. "Enough serious talk," Blake said, checking his watch. "Lunch? There's a new place on Newberry Street I've been wanting to try." I agreed, setting aside my concerns for the moment. As we walked to the restaurant, arm in arm, I found myself studying the well-dressed professionals hurrying past us on the sidewalk, wondering how many of them also maintained careful facades that hid complicated truths. The Harringtons weren't unique in their deception. Many families, many institutions, projected strength while containing fatal weaknesses. The difference was that most didn't treat others with the dismissive superiority that Victoria had shown me. Over lunch, Blake mentioned an upcoming charity gala that his mother was organizing. "It's the annual Harrington Foundation event," he explained. "Black tie, silent auction, the usual suspects writing checks to feel good about themselves." "Sounds delightful," I said dryly. He grinned. "It's actually important. The foundation funds educational programs for underprivileged kids. One of the few family traditions I fully support." His expression turned serious. "I'd really like you to be there. As my fiancé, not just as my date." I understood the distinction. This would be my first official appearance as Blake's future wife at a Harrington-sponsored event. Of course I'll be there. Fair warning, Mother is the chair of the foundation. She'll be in her element, running everything and everyone. "I can handle Victoria," I assured him, though I was already thinking about the opportunity this event presented. A public gathering of Boston's elite, with the Harringtons center stage, maintaining their illusion of unassailable prosperity. It might be the perfect setting for the next move in our unspoken game. After lunch, I returned to my office to find a message from an unexpected source. Eleanor Harrington requested I join her for tea the following afternoon. No explanation, just an address and time, delivered by her personal assistant. Curious and cautious, I accepted. Blake's grandmother had observed more than she'd participated at the dinner party, but I hadn't missed her shrewd assessment of every interaction. If Victoria was the Harrington family's sword, Eleanor was its eyes. The address turned out to be a private room at the Boston Athenaeum, one of the city's oldest libraries and cultural institutions. I found Eleanor already seated when I arrived, a silver tea service before her and a stack of leather-bound books at her elbow. "Ms. Bennett," she greeted me, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Prompt. I appreciate that." "Mrs. Harrington," I replied, taking the seat. "Thank you for the invitation." She poured tea with practiced precision, her hands steady despite her age. "I wanted to speak with you privately, away from Victoria's theatrics and Edward's posturing." I accepted the delicate teacup she offered. "May I ask why?" Eleanor's piercing blue eyes, so like Blake's, assessed me openly. "You intrigue me. Most of Blake's young women have wilted under Victoria's scrutiny. You push back, subtly but definitively." "I respect the Harrington family," I said carefully, "but I won't be intimidated by it." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Precisely. What makes you interesting?" She took a sip of her tea. "You know, I wasn't born a Harrington. I married into this family 60 years ago, when it was William Harrington, Edward's father, who sat at the head of the table." This surprised me. Eleanor seemed so thoroughly embedded in the family mythology that I'd assumed she was a Harrington by birth. "Victoria forgets that," Eleanor continued. "She speaks of Harrington traditions as if they're written in stone, when many of them began with me." She set down her cup with a decisive click. I was a Cabot, from a family that considered the Harringtons knew money upstarts. My father nearly disowned me for marrying William. I leaned forward, genuinely interested. "What changed his mind?" "Nothing. He went to his grave disapproving of my choice." Eleanor's smile was sharp with old satisfaction. "But I built this family into what it is today. The social connections, the political influence, the philanthropic footprint, those were my contributions. Victoria simply maintains what I created." I was beginning to understand why she'd wanted this meeting. "You're saying the Harrington legacy isn't as fixed as Victoria pretends." "Legacies evolve, Ms. Bennett. They must, or they die." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Victoria fears change because she lacks the vision to shape it. Edward fears it because he's made too many mistakes to weather it. Her frank assessment of her son and daughter-in-law caught me off guard. You're very candid, Mrs. Harrington. At my age, one hasn't time for pretense. She studied me with those penetrating eyes. You know about the financial troubles, don't you? Not just rumors. You have details. For a moment, I considered denying it, but something in her expression told me she would see through any evasion. Yes. She nodded, unsurprised. I thought as much. The question is, what do you intend to do with that knowledge? That depends, I said carefully. What do you think I should do with it? Eleanor laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. Clever? Girl, you answer a question with a question. She leaned back in her chair, regarding me thoughtfully. Edward has overextended himself catastrophically. Victoria refuses to acknowledge reality. And Blake, dear idealistic Blake, remains blissfully oblivious to the precipice we're approaching. And you? I asked. I'm too old to save them from themselves, she said with a sigh, but not too old to recognize someone who might. Her gaze sharpened. You're more than you appear to be, Eliza Bennet. Your understanding of financial matters extends beyond what your position at Blackwell would suggest. I remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. Blake loves you, Eleanor continued. That much is obvious. The question is whether you love him enough to help salvage what can be saved of his inheritance. I love Blake for who he is, I said firmly, not for his name or his supposed inheritance. A pretty sentiment. But if you truly care for him, you must care about the legacy that has shaped him. Eleanor picked up her teacup again. The Harrington name may not matter to you, Ms. Bennet, but it matters deeply to my grandson. What would destroy Edward and Victoria would merely wound them, their pride, their social standing. But for Blake, watching the family legacy crumble would cut to his very core. Her words struck uncomfortably close to my own concerns. Blake's sense of duty to his family name ran deep. How would he react if he learned that the legacy he felt bound to protect was already in tatters, and that I had known and said nothing? Why are you telling me this? I asked. Eleanor's smile was enigmatic. Let's just say I've lived long, enough to recognize when the old guard needs to step aside for new blood. Victoria will never accept you, but she doesn't need to. I'm simply trying to determine whether you're the right kind of adversary for her, one who might actually save this family while defeating her. As I left the Athenaeum, Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. She had practically given me her blessing to challenge Victoria's authority, while making it clear that her primary concern was protecting Blake and whatever could be salvaged of the Harrington legacy. What she couldn't know was how deeply her assessment had resonated with my own conflicted thoughts. The power I held over the Harringtons through their mortgage had initially felt like perfect poetic justice, a shield against Victoria's disdain, and Edward's manipulation. But now, entangled with my genuine love for Blake, it had become something more complicated. I didn't want to destroy the Harrington legacy. I wanted to transform it, to strip away the artifice and pretension, leaving something authentic that Blake could rebuild in his own image. And perhaps that had been my true goal all along. The Harrington Foundation Gala was held at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, in the soaring glass-ceilinged courtyard that had been transformed for the evening with dramatic lighting, cascading, flower arrangements, and strategically placed cocktail bars. As Blake and I entered, I felt the subtle shift in the crowd's attention. Curious glances, whispered comments behind gloved hands, the assessment of Boston society taking full measure of Blake Harrington's controversial fiancé. I'd chosen my gown carefully, a deep emerald silk that was elegant without being ostentatious, complemented by a simple diamond pendant and matching earrings. Blake, resplendent in his tuxedo, kept his hand at the small of my back as we navigated. The crowd, stopping frequently to exchange greetings with people whose names I'd memorized from the guest list I'd studied beforehand. Blake, darling. Victoria materialized before us, stunning in midnight blue, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. You're late. The Whitakers have been asking for you. Mother? Blake leaned in to kiss her cheek. You remember Eliza? Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course. Lovely dress, dear. So, appropriate. The emphasis suggested she'd expected me to commit some fashion faux pas that would embarrass Blake. Thank you, Victoria. The foundation has done an amazing job with the event. I was just admiring the centerpieces. Yes, well, presentation matters in these circles. Her gaze swept over me one last time before returning to Blake. The governor's here. He specifically asked to speak with you about that healthcare initiative. I'll find him later, Blake promised. Right now, I'd like to introduce Eliza to some people. Victoria's smile tightened fractionally. Of course. Though do make time for the Whitakers. Caroline's daughter just graduated from Harvard Law. As she glided away, Blake sighed. Sorry. She's still stuck on the idea that I should have married Caroline Whitaker. We dated for about 3 minutes in college. And she has a Harvard Law degree, I teased. Clearly superior to my mere Brown economics degree. He laughed, relaxing slightly. Come on, there are some people I actually want you to meet. For the next hour, we circulated through the crowd, Blake introducing me to colleagues, friends, and family connections. Some were genuinely welcoming. Others maintained the same polite frost that characterized Victoria's interactions with me. I cataloged each face, each name, building my mental map of the Harrington social universe. Edward found us as we were examining items in the silent auction. Blake, Senator Williams was asking about you. He's by the South Bar. Blake hesitated, glancing at me. Go ahead, I encouraged him. I'm perfectly capable of bidding on auction items without supervision. Once Blake had reluctantly departed, Edward turned to me with an appraising look. You clean up well, Eliza. One might almost mistake you for someone who belongs here. I smiled pleasantly. High praise indeed, Edward. Though I wonder, what exactly does belonging entail in your world? Is it just appearance, or is there something more substantive? A flicker of wariness crossed his face. Since our lunch at Le Méridien, he'd been keeping a careful distance, uncertain of exactly how much I knew about his financial situation. Substance is certainly part of it, he said carefully. Understanding the responsibilities that come with privilege, maintaining certain standards, protecting family interests. Interesting that you mention family interests. I examined a listing for a week at a luxury villa in Tuscany, noting the current bid. I've been thinking a lot about what truly serves a family's long-term interests. Sometimes what appears protective in the short term can be destructive over time. Edward's expression hardened slightly. If you have something specific to say, Eliza, perhaps you should say it directly. I turned to face him. All right. I know about the equity line against the estate. I know about the loans leveraged against your company shares. I know that Harrington Financial Group is one bad quarter away from a liquidity crisis. He blanched, glancing quickly around to ensure no one was within earshot. That's absurd, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's documented, I replied calmly. The question is, does Blake know how precarious his inheritance has become? Edward's composure slipped further. You wouldn't dare. Actually, I've been protecting him from the truth, but I wonder how long that's fair to him. After all, he'll eventually inherit this situation. What exactly do you want? Edward's voice had dropped to a tense whisper. For now? Just acknowledgement that I'm not as ignorant or powerless as you and Victoria have assumed. Blake loves me, and I love him. I'm going to be part of this family whether Victoria approves or not. And in return for your Discretion? His eyes had hardened into calculating points. We'll discuss that later. For now, enjoy the gala. So many important people watching after all. Appearances to maintain. I left him standing by the auction table, his face a mask of contained fury and fear. It wasn't a knockout blow, merely the first jab in what would be a carefully orchestrated series. Edward now knew that I had information that could devastate his family's reputation, but not how I intended to use it. As I made my way through the crowded room, I caught sight of Eleanor Harrington, holding court among a group of elderly Boston matriarchs. Her shrewd eyes met mine briefly, and I could have sworn I saw the ghost of an approving nod. I found Blake deep in conversation with a silver-haired man I recognized as Senator Williams. He brightened when he saw me, immediately drawing me into their circle. "Senator, this is my fiancée, Eliza Bennett. Eliza, Senator Robert Williams." "A pleasure, Ms. Bennett." The senator's handshake was firm, his assessment swift and comprehensive. "Blake tells me you're in finance as well." "Investment management," I confirmed, though on a somewhat smaller scale than Harrington Financial. "Scale isn't everything," he said, surprising me with his candor. "In fact, I was just telling Blake that some of the most innovative approaches are coming from boutique firms focusing on targeted investments rather than broad market plays." "My thoughts exactly," I said, warming to him. "Especially as clients become more concerned with where their money is going, not just what return it's generating." The senator nodded approvingly. "Precisely the point I've been making to Edward. For years, though he remains committed to the old models." He turned to Blake. "Your fiancé understands the shifting landscape. That's refreshing." The conversation continued, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the senator's insights. He was that rarity in politics, someone who actually understood the financial systems he helped regulate. When he eventually excused himself to greet other guests, Blake squeezed my hand. "He liked you," he said, sounding pleased but not surprised. "He's more forward-thinking than I expected. Bob's an old family friend. He and my grandfather served on several boards together." Blake's expression grew thoughtful. "He's been trying to convince Dad to modernize our approach for ages. Maybe with you on my side, we can finally make some headway." The idea that Blake saw me as an ally in transforming his family business caused a pang of guilt. How would he feel when he learned the extent of Edward's mismanagement? Or worse, when he discovered my role in controlling his family's home? Before I could respond, Victoria appeared again, this time with an elegant older woman in tow. "Blake, darling, you remember Mrs. Aldrich. She was just asking about your wedding plans." Mrs. Aldrich, whom I recognized as the chairwoman of another prominent Boston family foundation, smiled benignly. "Such exciting times, planning a wedding. Have you set a date yet?" "We're thinking September," Blake began, but Victoria swiftly interjected. "Though June would be more traditional for a Harrington wedding," she said smoothly. "The family has a long history of June brides." "September suits us better," I said firmly, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. "Blake and I both prefer fall colors." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Traditions evolve, I suppose," she conceded, though her tone suggested this was a personal affront. "Mrs. Aldrich is on the board of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Eliza. She's been instrumental in their educational outreach programs. The introduction was a test, Victoria presenting me to one of her peers, waiting for me to reveal my inadequacy through some social misstep. Instead, I engaged Mrs. Aldrich in a detailed conversation about the symphony's initiatives, drawing on research I'd done about Boston's cultural institutions. By the time Mrs. Aldrich moved on to greet other guests, Victoria was looking at me with barely concealed irritation. Her attempt to highlight my outsider status had backfired. "You've certainly done your homework," she said, her voice cool. "I believe in being prepared," I replied simply. "Yes, well." She glanced around the room, clearly searching for another strategy. Blake, your father needs you for the donor recognition ceremony. It's starting in 10 minutes. As Blake excused himself to prepare for his role in the evening's formal program, Victoria lingered, studying me with calculating eyes. You're putting on quite a performance tonight, she observed. One might almost believe you belong in these circles. Perhaps I'm not performing at all, I suggested. Perhaps your assessment of me has simply been wrong from the beginning. Her laugh was soft but cutting. Oh, Eliza, I've been navigating these waters for 30 years. I know an ambitious social climber when I see one, and I recognize someone desperately clinging to status and traditions that may not be as secure as she pretends, I countered. Victoria's face hardened. Careful. You're engaged to my son, not yet married to him. Things can change. Indeed, they can, I agreed. For instance, I just had a fascinating conversation with your husband about finances. The color drained slightly from her perfectly made-up face. I don't know what Edward may have told you. He didn't need to tell me anything, I interrupted gently. Financial analysis is my profession, after all. And the Harrington family finances tell quite a story when one knows how to read them. Victoria took a half step closer, her voice dropping to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. If you think you can use this to manipulate your way into our family, I'm already in your family, Victoria. Blake has chosen me. The only question is whether you'll accept that reality gracefully or continue this increasingly pointless resistance. For a moment, genuine confusion crossed her face. She had expected me to be either intimidated by her or obviously mercenary, someone she could dismiss or buy off. My calm confidence unsettled her deeply. Who are you, really? She asked, studying me with new wariness. Exactly who I appear to be, I replied. The woman who loves your son. The woman who will be his wife. And perhaps, if you can move beyond your prejudices, an ally rather than an adversary. Before she could respond, the evening's program began, with Edward Harrington taking the podium to welcome donors and recognize major contributors to the I Foundation. Victoria gave me one last measuring look before moving to take her place in the front row. I watched as Edward delivered his practiced speech, all confidence and charm, showing no sign of the fear I'd glimpsed earlier. Blake joined him on stage, speaking passionately about the Foundation's educational initiatives and their impact on underprivileged communities. Looking at them side by side, father and son, representing the Harrington legacy, I felt the full weight of what was at stake. Edward was gambling with a heritage that wasn't solely his to risk. Blake deserved to inherit something real, not a hollow shell of former glory maintained through financial sleight of hand and social pretense. After the ceremony, as champagne flowed and the orchestra played, I found myself momentarily alone near one of the magnificent floral arrangements. Diane appeared beside me, elegant in black, ostensibly another wealthy donor, but actually there at my request to observe the Harringtons in their natural habitat. Edward looks rattled, she noted quietly. What did you say to him? I showed him my cards, I replied. Not all of them, but enough. And Victoria? She's suspicious but confused. She can't quite figure out my angle. Diane sipped her champagne thoughtfully. They're still underestimating you. That's good. For now, I agreed. But they won't, for much longer. I need to accelerate our timeline. Are you sure? Once you make your move with the mortgage, there's no going back. Blake will know everything. I watched Blake across the room, laughing with friends, completely unaware of the financial precipice his family was balanced on, or of my power to push them over the edge. The thought sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the crowded room. Not yet, I decided. I need to speak with Blake first, prepare him somehow. Without revealing what you know? Diane looked skeptical. Without revealing everything, I clarified. But he deserves some warning before his world turns upside down. As the evening wound down, Blake found me again, his face flushed with champagne and success. "The gala exceeded our fundraising goal," he said happily. "Best year ever." I smiled, genuinely pleased for him. "That's wonderful. Your passion for the foundation's work really comes through when you speak." "It's the one part of the family business I'm genuinely proud of," he admitted. "Making a difference beyond just generating wealth for people who already have plenty." Looking at him, his earnest enthusiasm, his genuine desire to create positive change, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Harrington legacy deserved, better than Edward's reckless gambles and Victoria's rigid snobbery, it deserved Blake's vision, his compassion, his integrity. That night, as we drove away from the museum, Blake asked unexpectedly, "Was it terrible, being under Mother's microscope all evening?" I thought carefully before answering. "It's not about me, Blake. It's about her fear of losing control, of you, of the family narrative, of the world she's carefully constructed." He glanced at me, surprised by my insight. "That's remarkably perceptive." "Your mother isn't as complicated as she thinks she is," I said softly. "She's protecting what she values in the only way she knows how. By being absolutely terrifying to anyone who threatens her vision of how things should be?" he suggested wryly. I laughed. "Something like that." After a moment, I added more seriously, "Blake, if you discovered something about your family, something that contradicted the image they've always presented, how would you handle it?" He frowned slightly. "That's an oddly specific question. Did someone say something to you tonight?" "No," I assured him quickly. "I'm just thinking about how families maintain their narratives across generations. How much is real and how much is carefully constructed fiction?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I've always suspected there are family secrets I don't know," he said finally. "Things Dad keeps compartmentalized. But I believe in the core of what we stand for, using privilege to create opportunity, measuring success by impact rather than just profit." "And if you learned that core was compromised?" I pressed gently. Blake's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Then I'd have to redefine it. Build something better on the ruins." He gave me a quizzical look. "Why all these theoretical questions?" I leaned over and kissed his cheek. "Just trying to understand the family I'm marrying into. Legacy is complicated. Not as complicated as surviving dinner with Victoria. Harrington," he joked, clearly wanting to lighten the mood. "Which you did spectacularly, by the way. I saw you talking with Senator Williams. He's not easily impressed." I let him change the subject, but my mind was racing with plans and contingencies. The evening had confirmed what I already suspected. Victoria and Edward would never willingly accept me as Blake's equal partner. Their vision of the Harrington legacy had no room for someone like me, except as a temporary aberration to be managed and eventually eliminated. But I had made my first countermove, letting Edward know that I understood his financial house of cards. Victoria, too, now suspected that I was more formidable than she had initially assumed. The balance of power was shifting, subtle, but unmistakable. The next phase would require perfect timing and execution. I needed to gain control of the narrative before Edward's financial maneuvers collapsed entirely, and I needed to do it in a way that preserved Blake's faith in me and in his family's core values. I glanced at Blake's profile as he drove, his features illuminated by passing streetlights. The man I loved was about to have his world upended. I could only hope that when the dust settled, he would understand why I had kept my silence for so long, and why I was finally breaking it. 3 days after the gala, my phone rang just after midnight. Diane's name flashed on the screen, and immediately I knew something significant had happened. She never called this late unless it was urgent. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. "Edward Harrington is making a move, a big one." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What?" "Kind of move. He's trying to refinance the estate through Meridian Capital Group. If it goes through, it would effectively transfer your controlling interest to them." My pulse quickened. "Can he do that? The terms of our holding company agreement?" "He can't, legally," Diane interrupted. "But he doesn't know he's dealing with you. He thinks he's negotiating with Ashcroft International Holdings." Ashcroft International was the shell company I'd established to purchase the Harrington mortgage. Edward had no idea that the faceless foreign investment group he was trying to outmaneuver was actually the woman engaged to his son. "How did you find out?" I asked, already reaching for my laptop. "Remember Carter Phillips from law school? He's working at Meridian now. He recognized the Harrington estate listing and called me, thinking I might want to know given your special interest in the family." I logged into my secure server, reviewing the latest updates on my holdings. "What's Edward offering them?" "A higher interest rate and accelerated payment schedule in exchange for a complete restructuring. But here's the interesting part. He's not using Harrington Financial for the deal. He's created a separate entity called Eastbrook Partners." "He's hiding it from the board," I murmured, thinking quickly. "Probably from Victoria and Blake, too." "Exactly. He's getting desperate, Eliza. This kind of move, it's high risk, even for him." I considered the implications. Edward was attempting to regain control of the estate mortgage without anyone in his family knowing how precarious their situation had become. If he succeeded, he'd eliminate the leverage I currently held without ever revealing his financial missteps. "We need to block this," I decided, immediately. "I've already drafted a refusal letter from Ashcroft, but Eliza—" Diane hesitated. "This means we're moving up our timeline. Once Edward receives this rejection, he'll know something isn't right. He'll start digging deeper. Then we need to be ready." I closed my laptop, my mind racing through contingencies. "Set up a meeting with the bank officers for tomorrow, and contact Senator Williams' office. I want to discuss potential regulatory implications of Harrington Financial's recent activities." After ending the call with Diane, I lay awake for hours, planning my next moves. Edward's desperate gambit had forced my hand. I'd intended to approach Blake gradually, preparing him for the revelations about his family's finances and my role in them. Now I might not have that luxury. The following morning, I arrived at my office earlier than usual, reviewing the documents Diane had sent overnight. Edward's refinancing proposal was even more reckless than I'd initially thought. He was essentially betting the entire Harrington estate on a high-risk foreign investment that promised astronomical returns, but had all the hallmarks of a sophisticated scam. My intercom buzzed shortly after 9. "Ms. Bennett, Mr. Edward Harrington is here to see you." I stiffened in surprise. "Edward, coming to my office?" This was unexpected. "Send him in." Edward entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, but I detected an undercurrent of tension in his posture. He was impeccably dressed as always, but there was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Eliza," he greeted me, declining to wait for an invitation before settling into the chair across from my desk. "I hope I'm not interrupting. Anything important?" "Not at all," I replied, carefully closing the folder containing his refinancing proposal. "What can I do for you, Edward?" He studied me for a moment, as if trying to solve a particularly vexing puzzle. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the gala, about your concerns regarding Harrington Financial." "I wouldn't call them concerns," I corrected smoothly. "Just observations." "Yes, well," he cleared his throat. "I believe there may have been some misunderstanding. The company is on extremely solid footing. Any temporary adjustments to our portfolio are simply strategic realignments to capitalize on emerging markets." I almost admired his ability to deliver corporate doublespeak with such conviction. Is that what you call leveraging the family? Estate for the third time in 2 years? Strategic realignment? His expression hardened. You seem remarkably well informed about private family matters. Financial analysis is my profession, I reminded him, and the mortgage history of the Harrington estate isn't as private as you might think. Edward leaned forward, dropping the pretense of casual conversation. Let's be direct. What exactly do you want, Eliza? Money? A position at Harrington Financial? Whatever your angle is, I'm prepared to be reasonable, within limits. The assumption that I must be angling for some personal gain was so predictable, it was almost disappointing. You misunderstand me, Edward. I'm not looking for a payoff or a job. My concern is for Blake. Blake? He seemed genuinely confused. Yes, your son. The man I'm going to marry. The one who believes he'll someday inherit a thriving family business and historic estate, not a shell company drowning in hidden debt. Edward's face flushed with anger. You have no right to interfere in family business matters. I'm about to become family, I reminded him. And unlike you, I'm not willing to let Blake walk blindly into a financial disaster you've created. For a moment, genuine fear flashed in Edward's eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of Blake discovering the truth. Blake doesn't need to know about temporary financial adjustments. I've weathered downturns before. The market will recover, and so will our investments. And if they don't? I challenged. If that venture in Singapore collapses completely? If Eastbrook Partners can't secure new financing for the estate? Edward went very still. How do you know about Eastbrook? I allowed myself a small smile. As I said, financial analysis is my profession. He stood abruptly, his facade of control cracking. Whatever you think you know, whatever you're planning, remember that you're dealing with a family that has navigated Boston politics and finance for 5 generations. Don't make an enemy of me, Eliza. I don't want to be your enemy, Edward, I said quietly. I want to be your daughter-in-law. I want Blake to have the legacy he deserves, one built on honesty and solid foundations, not desperate gambles and hidden debts. You have no idea what you're talking about, he snapped, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. Stay out of Harrington business matters. Focus on planning your wedding and leave the financial decisions to those of us who understand them. After he stormed out, I sat motionless for several minutes, processing the interaction. Edward was even more desperate than I'd realized. His visit had been an attempt to neutralize me, to buy my silence or intimidate me into backing off. Instead, he'd only confirmed what I already knew. The Harrington empire was teetering on the brink of collapse, and Edward was willing to risk everything to maintain the illusion of success and control. I reached for my phone and dialed Blake. Are you free for dinner tonight? There's something important we need to discuss. That evening, I prepared Blake's favorite meal in my apartment, pasta carbonara with a bottle of the Barolo he'd introduced me to on our 3rd date. This conversation would be difficult enough. I wanted the setting to be comfortable, intimate, free from the prying eyes of Boston society. When Blake arrived, he sensed my tension immediately. What's wrong? He asked, kissing me hello. You sounded serious on the phone. Sit down, I said gently. We need to talk about your family. His expression grew wary. What happened? Did my mother say something to you after the gala? No, it's not about Victoria. It's about Harrington Financial, about your father's management of the company. Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know he's been resistant to my suggestions for modernizing our approach. It's more serious than that, I interrupted. Blake, the company is in trouble. Significant trouble. He stared at me, confusion and disbelief warring in his expression. That's not possible. We just had our most profitable quarter in 3 years. Dad showed me the reports himself. Those Reports were carefully edited, I said gently. The real numbers tell a different story. And how exactly would you know the real numbers? A hint of defensiveness crept into his voice. This was the moment of partial truth, not the full revelation of my ownership of their mortgage, but enough to start preparing him for what was coming. I've been tracking unusual patterns in Harrington Financial's public filings for some time, I explained. Initially as part of my regular market analysis work, but when we became serious, I started paying closer attention. You've been investigating my family's company? Blake stood, pacing to the window and back. Why wouldn't you just ask me if you had concerns? Would you have known the answers? I challenged gently. Does your father share the complete financial picture with you, or just the highlights he wants you to see? Blake's silence was answer enough. After a moment, he sat back down, his expression troubled. What exactly are you claiming? I crossed to my desk and retrieved a folder containing a carefully curated selection of documents, enough to demonstrate Edward's financial mismanagement without revealing my personal stake in their mortgage. The European expansion has been losing money consistently for 18 months, I began, laying out reports and analyses. The Singapore venture you mentioned at the gala is on the verge of collapse, and your father has been taking increasingly desperate measures to cover these losses without allowing them to appear in the company's public statements. Blake reviewed the documents with growing alarm. His financial acumen was strong enough to understand what he was seeing. This can't be right, he said, but there was doubt in his voice. Dad would have told me if things were this bad. Would he? I asked softly. Blake, your father is mortgaging the family's future to maintain the appearance of success. He's created shell companies to hide debt, leveraged family assets including your estate, and misled the board about the company's true financial position. Why would he do that? It doesn't make sense. Pride, I suggested. Fear of being the Harrington who lost it all. Maybe belief that one more big play will turn everything around. Blake stood again, unable to sit still as his world began to crack around him. If what you're showing me is true, and I'm not saying I'm convinced it is, then the company could be facing bankruptcy, I finished when he couldn't say the word. Within 6 to 8 months, unless drastic measures are taken immediately. He shook his head, struggling to absorb the implications. And the estate? Our home? This was the most delicate part. I couldn't yet tell him that I controlled the mortgage, but I couldn't lie to him either. The estate has been refinanced multiple times. The current mortgage holder is a company called Ashcroft International Holdings. I've never heard of them. Few people have. They're a private investment group that specializes in acquiring distressed assets. Blake ran, his hands over his face, looking suddenly exhausted. Why are you telling me this now? Why not earlier? I needed to be certain of my facts, I said, which was true if incomplete. And I hoped that your father might change course before things reached this point. But he's making increasingly risky moves, Blake. Someone needed to tell you the truth before it's too late. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across my dining table. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and determination. I need to confront him. I need to hear this from him directly. I think that's wise, I agreed carefully. But you should be prepared. He'll likely deny everything at first. What would you suggest? There was no sarcasm in his question. Only a genuine request for guidance. Go in with specific questions. Ask about Eastbrook Partners. Ask about the Singapore venture's actual returns, not the projected ones. Ask about the current status of the estate mortgage. Blake nodded slowly. And you're certain about all this? There's no chance you've misinterpreted something? I met his gaze steadily. I wish I were wrong, Blake, but the evidence is clear. Your father has been gambling with the Harrington legacy, and he's losing. He stood, gathering the documents. I'd prepared. I need time to process this. to figure out what to do. Of course. I touched his arm gently. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you. This doesn't change how I feel about you, about us. After Blake left, I called Diane to update her on the situation. I've told him about the financial troubles, but not about my ownership of the mortgage. Not yet. How did he take it? She asked. As well as can be expected, he wants to confront Edward directly. That could accelerate everything. Edward might panic if he realizes Blake knows the truth. That's what I'm counting on, I said. Edward needs to be the one to tell Blake about the refinancing attempts. Then when Blake discovers my connection to Ashcroft, it will be in the context of his father's deception, not mine. Diane sighed. It's a dangerous game you're playing, Eliza. The personal and financial are completely entangled now. They always were, I replied. From the moment I fell in love with Blake Harrington. The next 24 hours would be critical. Once Blake confronted his father, the carefully constructed facade the Harringtons had maintained for years would begin to crumble. Victoria would fight viciously to preserve appearances. Edward would scramble for new financial maneuvers. And eventually, inevitably, the truth about Ashcroft International and my role in controlling their mortgage would come to light. I had set events in motion that couldn't be reversed. All I could do now was ensure that when the Harrington legacy finally shattered, Blake would be positioned to rebuild something better from the pieces. Something authentic, something sustainable. Something worthy of the man he truly was, not the heir his parents had tried to shape him into. Blake called me at dawn the next morning, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I need to see you. Now. 30 minutes later, he was at my door, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, as if he'd been up all night. The moment I let him in, I knew that something fundamental had changed. You were right, he said without preamble, pacing. My living room like a caged animal. All of it. The company's finances, the hidden debt, the refinancing attempts. It's actually worse than you thought. I guided him to the couch, pressing a cup of coffee into his hands. You confronted your father? I went to the house last night after leaving here. He was in his study, working late, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. Dad never works late unless there's a crisis. Blake took a shaky sip of coffee. I asked him about Eastbrook Partners. He tried to dismiss it, said it was just a small side investment, but I kept pushing, using the specific questions you suggested. And he finally admitted the truth? Blake's laugh was hollow. Not willingly, but I wouldn't let it go. Finally, he exploded, told me I couldn't possibly understand the complexities of maintaining a family legacy in today's financial environment, that sometimes rules had to be bent, appearances maintained at all costs. I sat beside him, close enough to offer support but giving him space to process. How bad is it? The company's basically insolvent. Dad's been shifting assets, creating dummy corporations, using one loan to pay off another. It's all smoke and mirrors. Blake ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. And the estate? God, Eliza, he's mortgaged it to the hilt. If this Ashcroft company called in the loan, we'd lose everything. I felt a twist of guilt at the mention of Ashcroft, but pushed it aside. Was your mother there during this conversation? She came in halfway through. I've never seen her like that. Not angry, but scared. Blake's voice softened slightly. It turns out she didn't know the full extent of it either. Dad's been keeping her in the dark, too, letting her believe everything was fine, that maintaining appearances was just about upholding traditions, not covering financial disaster. How did she react? She went completely silent at first. Then she started asking questions, specific, detailed questions about assets and liabilities. It was like watching someone I'd never met before. Beneath all that social director perfection, Mother apparently has a surprisingly sharp financial mind. This revelation about Victoria surprised me. I'd underestimated her, assuming she was merely the family's social gatekeeper, not a potential strategic thinker in her own right. "What happens now?" I asked carefully. Blake set down his coffee cup and turned to face me directly. "That's why I'm here. After the initial shock, after Mom started making phone calls to her family's lawyers, Dad got desperate. He started talking about this Ashcroft company, about how if he could just negotiate with them directly, he might salvage something." My pulse quickened. "And?" "He said the strangest thing. He said he'd tried to research them, tried to find out who really controls Ashcroft, but kept hitting dead ends. Shell companies, offshore accounts, a deliberate maze designed to hide the true ownership." Blake's eyes locked with mine. That's when he mentioned that the timing of Ashcroft's acquisition of our mortgage coincided with certain other events. I held my breath, knowing what was coming. Specifically, he mentioned that Ashcroft purchased the mortgage approximately 6 months before you and I met. Blake's voice had gone very quiet. "An interesting coincidence," he called it. I didn't speak, watching the play of emotions across Blake's face. Then he asked me what I knew about your family's finances, about where exactly your father went after his firm collapsed. Blake leaned forward slightly. "So, I'm asking you, Eliza, is there a connection I should know about?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than I'd planned, forced by Edward's desperate attempt to shift blame. I could deny it, concoct a story Blake might even believe temporarily. But the truth would emerge eventually, and any lie now would only deepen the betrayal he would ultimately feel. "Yes," I said simply. "There's a connection." Blake went very still. "You're going to have to be more specific than that." I took a deep breath. Ashcroft International Holdings is a company I control through a series of carefully structured ownership agreements. I am, effectively, the mortgage holder on the Harrington estate. The shock on his face was profound. For several seconds, Blake simply stared at me, as if trying to make sense of my words. "That's not possible," he finally said. "You couldn't afford your position at Blackwell." "My public job at Blackwell is only one facet of my financial activities," I explained. "I've built a separate investment portfolio over the years, operating under different business entities. Most of my wealth is deliberately inconspicuous." "And you deliberately acquired my family's mortgage?" Disbelief was giving way to anger. "When? Why?" "The acquisition happened 6 months before we met," I confirmed, "and it was purely a business decision at the time. The mortgage had been bundled with several other high-value properties and was being mismanaged by its previous holder. I saw an opportunity for a solid investment." "And then you just happened to meet me? To fall in love with me?" Suspicion darkened his features. "Was any of it real, Eliza?" The accusation stung, but I'd anticipated it. "All of it was real, Blake. Meeting you was coincidence. I had no idea when I acquired that mortgage that I would ever meet you, let alone fall in love with you. By the time I realized whose estate I controlled, we were already deeply involved." "And you didn't think this was something you should mention?" His voice rose. "My God, Eliza, you've known all along that my family's home was leveraged to a company you control. You've watched my father scramble to maintain appearances, watched my mother treat you like an outsider, all while holding the power to make them homeless with one signature." "I was trying to find the right moment to tell you," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the storm of emotion between us. "To explain the full situation without looking like you deliberately targeted my family? Without seeming like this whole relationship was some elaborate revenge scheme?" Blake stood abruptly, pacing again. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" "I know exactly how it looks," I acknowledged, "which is why I've been so careful about how and when to reveal the truth. But Blake, you have to believe me. I love you. That has nothing to do with the mortgage or your family name. Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been playing a long game, getting close to me, gathering information about my family's finances, positioning yourself to, what? Take over? Force my parents into submission? If that had been my goal, I could have foreclosed months ago, I pointed out. I've maintained the current terms of the mortgage without change, despite your father's late payments. I've protected your family's interests more than Edward has. This gave him pause. The late payments? You knew about those? Of course you did, he answered himself. You've known everything all along. Not everything, I said quietly. I didn't know how deeply Edward had leveraged the company until recently. I didn't know about the shell corporations or the Singapore Ventures collapse. Those were discoveries I made while trying to understand the full picture before telling you the truth. Blake sank back onto the couch, emotional exhaustion evident in every line of his body. So what happens now? You foreclose? Take the estate? Complete your conquest of the mighty Harringtons? That was never my intention, I said firmly. Blake, I want to help save your family legacy, not destroy it. He looked at me skeptically. By holding our mortgage hostage? By offering a way out. A restructuring that would allow your family to maintain ownership of the estate while implementing proper financial controls on the company. I leaned forward, willing him to understand. Blake, your father's reckless financial decisions are what put your family at risk. I acquired that mortgage before I ever met you. But now that I have, I can use that position to help, not harm. And I'm supposed to just trust you? After learning you've been hiding something this significant from me for our entire relationship? His words cut deep, but they weren't unfair. I don't expect immediate trust, I acknowledged. But I'm asking you to consider my actions, not just this revelation. I could have used this leverage against your family at any point. Instead, I've protected your interests, even while your mother was trying to drive me away and your father was attempting to outmaneuver me financially. Blake was quiet for a long moment, processing. Does anyone else know about this? About your connection to Ashcroft? Just my attorney, Diane. And now your father suspects, though he doesn't have proof. And my mother. I don't believe so, unless Edward has told her since your conversation last night. Blake stood, moving to the window to stare out at the Boston skyline brightening with the morning sun. I need time to think, Eliza. It's too much to process all at once. I understand, I said softly. Take whatever time you need. He turned back to face me, his expression complex. Hurt, confusion, but also a stubborn determination I recognized and loved. I'm not saying I'm walking away, but I need to be sure of what I'm walking toward. After Blake left, I sank onto the couch, emotionally drained. The confrontation had gone neither as badly as I'd feared, nor as well as I'd hoped. Blake hadn't immediately ended our engagement, but the trust between us had been severely damaged. Whether it could be repaired remained to be seen. My phone rang. Diane. Edward Harrington just called a board meeting for tomorrow morning, she reported. Emergency session, full attendance required. He's making some kind of announcement. He's going to try to get ahead of this, I realized. Frame the narrative before the full extent of the financial problems becomes public. Or he's preparing to step down, Diane suggested. Cut his losses, preserve what reputation he can. Either way, we need to be prepared. I straightened, mind already shifting from personal turmoil to strategic planning. Have our legal team ready. If Edward tries to mobilize the board against Ashcroft, we'll need to respond quickly. And Blake? Diane asked gently. How did he take the news? About as well as could be expected, I said, unable to keep the sadness from my voice. He needs time. Time may be in short supply, Diane warned. once this starts becoming public, events will move quickly. She was right. The carefully constructed chess game I'd been playing was about to accelerate into a full-blown crisis. Edward was cornered but still dangerous. Victoria, with her newly revealed financial acumen, would be mobilizing whatever resources the Harrington name could still command. And Blake was caught in the middle, trying to reconcile his love for me with what he now saw as a profound betrayal of trust. I needed to act decisively, but with care. The next moves would determine not just the fate of the Harrington estate and company, but the future of my relationship with Blake. As if on cue, my phone chimed with a text message from an unexpected source. Victoria Harrington. We need to talk. Alone. Boston Harbor Hotel, 2 p.m. I stared at the message, surprised not by the demand for a meeting, but by Victoria's directness. No social niceties, no veiled threats wrapped in polite language. Just a straightforward request, or command, to meet. I texted back a simple confirmation, then called Diane again. Victoria wants to meet. Today. It's a trap, Diane said immediately. Edward sent her to feel you out, see what leverage they might have. Perhaps, I agreed. Or maybe Victoria has her own agenda now that she knows the full extent of Edward's deception. Be careful, Diane warned. The Harringtons are most dangerous when they're desperate. As I prepared for the meeting with Victoria, I considered my options carefully. The full truth was now in play. Blake knew about my connection to the faux mortgage, and Edward suspected it. Only Victoria remained potentially in the dark about the specific details, though she clearly knew enough to request this meeting. I could continue the confrontational approach, using my leverage to dictate terms, or I could offer an olive branch. A partnership of sorts that would allow the Harringtons to save face while implementing the financial reforms necessary to salvage what remained of their legacy. Everything depended on what Victoria wanted from this meeting. Was she coming as an enemy, determined to protect her family from the outsider who had infiltrated their ranks? Or as a pragmatist, recognizing that I might represent the best chance to preserve what mattered most to her? Either way, I would need to be ready for whatever came next. The game had changed. The pieces were in motion, and the final outcome remained impossible to predict. The Boston Harbor Hotel exuded old-world luxury, the kind of place where deals that shaped the city had been made for generations. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table in the lounge with a view of both the entrance and the harbor beyond. Strategic positioning had become second nature. Victoria arrived precisely at 2, not a minute earlier or later. She wore a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without flashiness, her only jewelry a simple strand of pearls and her wedding ring. Gone was the society hostess with her practiced smiles and subtle barbs. This was a woman on a mission. She spotted me immediately and crossed the room with purposeful strides, declining the server's offer of assistance. As she took the seat across from me, I noticed the subtle signs of strain, slight shadows beneath her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that even expert makeup couldn't fully conceal. "Thank you for coming," she said, foregoing the usual social niceties. "Your message was compelling in its directness," I replied. A server approached, and Victoria ordered tea without consulting the menu. I asked for the same, and we sat in taut silence until he departed. "Blake came to see you this morning," she said, not a question. "Yes. And you told him about your connection to our mortgage." So she knew. "Yes," I confirmed, though it seems Edward had already planted the seed of suspicion. Victoria's mouth tightened. "Edward has made many miscalculations recently. That was just one of them." She leaned forward slightly. "What I want to know, Eliza, is whether acquiring our mortgage was part of a deliberate strategy to infiltrate our family." "No," I said firmly. "The acquisition was a business decision made months before I met Blake. Our meeting was coincidence. But you maintained the deception after you realized whose mortgage you controlled. she pressed. I maintained privacy about my financial affairs, I corrected, as your family has certainly done about yours. Victoria acknowledged this with the barest inclination of her head. Fair point. She paused as the server returned with our tea, waiting until he had departed again before continuing. You must understand how this appears from our perspective. The timing is suspect. I understand completely, I said, meeting her gaze directly. If our positions were reversed, I would have the same suspicions. But the truth is simpler, if less dramatic. I saw an undervalued asset, acquired it as part of my investment strategy, and then unexpectedly fell in love with the son of the family, whose property I now controlled. Victoria studied me over the rim of her teacup. And now that you hold this leverage over us, what do you intend to do with it? Foreclosure would certainly be within your rights, given Edward's recent payment. History. Foreclosure has never been my goal, I replied. Despite what you might think of me, I love Blake. I don't want to destroy his family legacy. Then what do you want? The question was blunt, businesslike. I considered my answer carefully. Initially, recognition, acceptance. When you looked me in the eye at our engagement party and told me I would never be part of your family, it solidified my resolve to prove you wrong. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps even regret, crossed Victoria's face. And now? Now I want what Blake wants. A family legacy he can be proud of. Not one built on deception and financial manipulation, but on solid foundations and genuine value. Victoria set down her cup with deliberate precision. You think I don't want that for my son? I think you've been so focused on maintaining appearances that you've lost sight of what truly matters to Blake. Her eyes flashed with momentary anger, but she controlled it quickly. You presume to know what matters to my son after less than a year. I've known him his entire life. Have you? I challenged gently. Do you know that he dreams of restructuring Harrington Financial to focus on sustainable investments? That he values impact over profit margins? That he's stayed in a role that frustrates him out of duty to a legacy he believes in, even while that legacy was being hollowed out from within? Victoria was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You believe you understand my son better than I do. I believe I've listened to him in ways you perhaps haven't, I said. Not because you don't care, but because you've been so certain of what his future should look like that you haven't asked what he wants it to be. The bluntness of my assessment hung between us. I'd expected anger, dismissal, perhaps even a dramatic exit. Instead, Victoria surprised me. You may be right, she said quietly. Not about everything, but perhaps I have been too rigid in my vision for Blake's future. She straightened her already perfect posture. But that doesn't change our current situation. Edward has placed our family in an untenable position, and you hold significant leverage over us. Which brings us to why you wanted this meeting, I prompted. Victoria nodded once decisively. I want to propose an alliance. Of all the possibilities I'd considered, this was perhaps the most unexpected. An alliance. Yes. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Edward will be forced to step down after tomorrow's board meeting. The extent of his financial mismanagement cannot be concealed any longer. The company needs new leadership. Leadership with vision, integrity, and financial acumen. Blake, I realized. Blake, she confirmed. With the right support, the right partnership. I studied her carefully. And where do I fit into this scenario? You hold our mortgage. You clearly have financial skills that exceed what your current position would suggest, and despite everything, Blake loves you. Victoria's expression remained composed, but I detected the effort it cost her to make this acknowledgement. I'm proposing that instead of being adversaries, we become allies in salvaging what matters most, the core of the Harrington legacy, reshaped for a new era. With Blake at the helm, I said slowly. And you still maintaining influence behind the scenes. A ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips. I prefer to think of it as offering guidance based on decades of experience. But yes, I would remain involved. As would you, if you choose to accept this proposal. What exactly are you suggesting? That I join Harrington Financial in some capacity? I'm suggesting that you bring your financial expertise into the family officially, rather than exercising it from the shadows. A restructuring of both the company and our personal holdings, with your involvement not as an outside creditor, but as a family member. The irony of this proposal, coming from the woman who had looked me in the eye and told me I would never truly be part of her family, was almost dizzying. And what would this restructuring entail? Victoria laid out her vision with unexpected clarity and detail. The mortgage would be renegotiated on more sustainable terms. Edward would retire with a consulting title but no actual authority. Blake would assume leadership of a streamlined, refocused Harrington Financial, implementing many of the changes he had advocated for years. And I would have a formal role in the reorganization, leveraging my financial expertise while gaining legitimacy within Boston's business community. You've thought this through very thoroughly, I observed when she finished. I've had a sleepless night to consider our options, Victoria replied dryly. After 30 years of marriage, discovering that your husband has nearly bankrupted your family tends to focus the mind wonderfully. Despite everything, I felt a reluctant admiration for her resilience. And Blake? Has he agreed to this plan? I haven't discussed the specifics with him yet. I wanted to approach you first, to determine if such an alliance was even possible. Given our history, you mean? Victoria met my gaze directly. Yes, I've made my feelings about you quite clear in the past. I believed you were an outsider attempting to capitalize on my son's affections. I now recognize that assessment may have been incomplete. Coming from Victoria Harrington, this was tantamount to a full apology. That's very magnanimous. Of you, I said carefully. It's practical, she corrected. The circumstances have changed. Adaptability is essential for survival. I very nearly smiled at hearing my own words from the dinner party echoed back to me. Indeed it is. But there's one significant question you haven't addressed. What makes you think Blake will want any part of this restructuring after learning how his father has deceived him and how I've kept my own secrets? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Victoria's composed features. Because despite everything, Blake believes in the core of what the Harrington name should represent. Not the social posturing or the trappings of wealth, but the potential to create lasting positive impact. She hesitated, then added more quietly, and because he loves you, Eliza, deeply, in a way I've never seen before. The simple sincerity of this admission touched me unexpectedly. Has he told you that? He didn't need to. I know my son, even if I haven't always listened to him as I should have. Victoria straightened, her moment of vulnerability passing. The question is whether you love him enough to move past recriminations and work toward a shared future. I do love him, I said without hesitation. But reconciliation isn't entirely up to me. Blake feels betrayed, by his father, by me. He needs time. Time is the one luxury we don't have, Victoria said grimly. Once tomorrow's board meeting concludes, the situation will begin to become public. We need to present a united front before then. She was right, of course. The Boston financial community was small and rumors spread quickly. If Blake, Victoria, and I could align our interests before the inevitable publicity, we might still shape the narrative rather than be victims of it. What are you proposing specifically? I asked. A meeting. Tonight. You, me, Blake, and Eleanor, who, incidentally, has suspected your financial involvement for some time. She's quite impressed with you, though she'd never admit it directly. I raised an eyebrow. Eleanor knows? My mother-in-law misses very little, Victoria said with the faintest hint of rueful admiration. She approached me this morning with her own theories about your connection to Ashcroft International. She's been quietly monitoring Edward's financial maneuvers for years, it seems. This explained Eleanor's cryptic comments during our tea at the Athenaeum. The family matriarch had been several steps ahead of all of us. And Edward? I asked. Will he be part of this meeting? Victoria's expression hardened. No. Edward's role in the family's future will be determined after we've established our path forward. His deception has changed certain fundamental dynamics. The careful phrasing suggested deeper marital issues than Victoria was willing to articulate. For the first time, I glimpsed the personal pain beneath her poised exterior, the betrayal of trust that extended far beyond financial matters. I'll attend the meeting, I decided, but I can't speak for Blake. He needs to make his own choices without pressure from either of us. Agreed. Victoria gathered her purse, preparing to leave. 7 o'clock at Eleanor's townhouse in Beacon Hill. The address will be messaged to you. She stood, then paused, looking down at me with an unreadable expression. You're not what I expected, Eliza Bennett. Neither are you, Victoria, I replied honestly. After she departed, I remained at the table, processing the unexpected turn of events. Victoria Harrington, who had once looked at me with undisguised disdain, was now proposing a partnership. The woman who had declared I would never be part of her family was essentially offering me a seat at the table, not as Blake's accessory, but as a strategic asset in my own right. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had acquired the Harrington mortgage as a business decision, then maintained control of it partly out of pride after Victoria's dismissal of me. Now that same mortgage had become the foundation for a potential alliance I could never have anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from Blake. We need to talk before whatever meeting my mother is arranging. I responded immediately. Your place in an hour? His reply was swift. See you then. As I left the hotel, I found myself thinking about the twisting path that had led to this moment. What had begun as a simple investment opportunity had evolved into something far more complex, a test of love, truth, and the possibility of redemption for a family legacy teetering on the brink of collapse. The next few hours would determine whether the Harrington name would crumble under the weight of past deceptions or be transformed into something new, something that honored tradition while embracing change. And they would determine whether Blake and I could build a future together on foundations of honesty rather than secrets. For the first time since this journey began, I felt genuine uncertainty about the outcome, but also, surprisingly, hope. Blake's downtown loft reflected his personality in ways his carefully neutral office at Harrington Financial never could. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, while the open interior blended modern design with carefully chosen vintage pieces. It was a space that honored tradition without being constrained by it, much like the man himself. He opened the door before I could knock, his expression guarded but not hostile. Come in, he said, stepping aside. I've been trying to wrap my head around everything. The living area was strewn with financial documents. Some I recognized from our conversation the previous evening, others clearly retrieved from his father's files. Blake had been doing his homework. Have you spoken with your mother? I asked, taking the seat he indicated. Briefly, she mentioned a family meeting tonight but was surprisingly vague about the details. He sat opposite me, studying my face. I'm guessing your conversation with her was more illuminating. She proposed an unexpected alliance, I confirmed. A restructuring of both the company and the family dynamics, with you taking leadership of Harrington Financial. Blake nodded slowly. That tracks with what she hinted at. What she didn't explain was your role in this new arrangement. She suggested I bring my financial expertise into the family officially, rather than exercising it from the shadows. I paused, watching him carefully. It was quite a reversal from her previous position on my suitability as a Harrington. "Mother is nothing if not pragmatic," Blake said with a hint of dry humor. "When the circumstances change, so do her strategies." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "But I'm less interested in her plans than in understanding where we stand, Eliza. You and me." This was the conversation that mattered most, beyond mortgages and family legacies and financial restructuring. "I love you," I said simply. "That hasn't changed, but I understand that my actions, keeping the mortgage ownership secret, have damaged your trust in me." "It's not just the secret itself," Blake said after a moment. "It's what it represents. You watched my family struggle, watched my father make increasingly desperate moves, all while holding the power to force a resolution. You let me remain blind to both the problems and your connection to them." "I was trying to protect you," I began. But he shook his head. "That's what my father said too when I confronted him. That he was protecting me from worries I couldn't change." Blake's voice tightened with frustration. "I'm not a child who needs sheltering, Eliza. I needed the truth, from both of you." His words struck home. In trying to manage the situation perfectly, to reveal everything in the ideal sequence, I had made the same mistake Edward had, underestimating Blake's ability to handle difficult realities. "You're right," I acknowledged. "I should have told you sooner. Not about your father's mismanagement. That wasn't my secret to tell, but about my connection to the mortgage. I was afraid of how you would perceive it, afraid it would overshadow what we've built together." "And now?" he asked. "Now I want complete honesty between us, whatever the consequences. No more strategic withholding, no more carefully managed revelations." I met his gaze directly. "I want a partnership built on trust, not calculation." Blake was quiet for a long moment, processing. "When did you realize you loved me, truly loved me, beyond any strategic advantage it might represent?" The question caught me off guard with its directness, but I answered without hesitation. "The night you took me sailing, remember? It was sunset on the harbor, and you were telling me about rebuilding the old sailboat with your grandfather. You weren't Blake Harrington, heir to a financial empire. You were just a man sharing something that mattered deeply to you." A soft smile touched his lips at the memory. "You asked more questions about restoring that boat than anyone ever had." "Because I could see how it lit you up from within," I said. "That was when I knew I was falling in love with you. Not your name. Not your position, just you." "And the mortgage," he pressed. "When did you realize whose property you controlled?" "After our third date," I admitted. "I had my team run standard background checks, a habit from years of investment caution. When the connection emerged, I was stunned. I considered stepping away from our relationship then, before things became serious." "Why didn't you?" "Because it was already too late," I said simply. "I was already falling for you, and because I believed, still believe, that what we have is real, independent of any financial entanglements." Blake stood, moving to the window to look out at the harbor where we'd sailed that evening I'd just recalled. "I spent last night questioning everything, wondering if our entire relationship was some elaborate revenge plot against my family. It wasn't," I said quietly. "It never was." He turned back to face me. "I know. That's what kept me from walking away entirely. Because when I look at all the moments we've shared, all the private conversations and small intimacies, they couldn't have been calculated. Not all of them." "None of them," I corrected gently. Blake nodded slowly. "So where does that leave us? I love you, Eliza. That hasn't changed either. But we can't simply go back to how things were before." "No," I agreed. We go forward instead. With honesty, with clarity about both our personal relationship and our professional entanglements. Starting with tonight's meeting? He asked. Starting now, I countered. Your mother wants you to take control of Harrington Financial, with me in some as-yet undefined advisory role. But what do you want, Blake? Not what your family expects or what tradition dictates. What would make you genuinely fulfilled? He seemed startled by the question, as if no one had ever asked it quite so directly before. I want, he began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. I want to transform the company into something that creates genuine value, not just financial returns, but positive impact. I've been pushing that vision from the margins for years, but always compromising to accommodate my father's more traditional approach. And the family legacy? How important is that to you? The name matters less to me than what it stands for, he said thoughtfully. I don't need to preserve the Harrington legacy exactly as it's been. I want to evolve it into something worthy of continuation. This was the Blake I had fallen in love with, thoughtful, principled, willing to challenge convention. Then that's what we build toward, I said. Not Victoria's vision or Edward's, but yours. A Harrington legacy redefined for a new era. He studied me with those intelligent blue eyes. And your role in this future? As my wife? As a financial partner? Both? That depends on whether you still want me as your wife, I said, vulnerability creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. Blake crossed the room in 3 strides, taking my hands in his. I do, he said firmly. The anger, the sense of betrayal, they're real. But so is this. He pressed my palm to his heart. So is us. I just need to know that from this moment forward we're completely honest with each other. No more secrets. No matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. No more secrets, I promised. Complete transparency, personal and financial. He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Then we faced tonight's meeting together, as partners. Eleanor Harrington's Beacon Hill townhouse was a showcase of understated luxury. Priceless antiques alongside modern art pieces, history and innovation coexisting in perfect balance. The family matriarch greeted us in a wood-paneled study that smelled of lemon polish and old books. Finally, she said dryly as Blake and I entered together. I was beginning to think we'd need to send a search party. Victoria was already seated by the fireplace, a glass of what appeared to be scotch in hand, a departure from her usual white wine. She looked up as we entered, her gaze assessing our linked hands with calculated interest. Blake, Eliza, I'm glad you could both make it. Her tone was neutral, but the subtle emphasis on both suggested she'd had doubts about whether Blake would bring me. You've staged quite the family summit, Mother, Blake observed, leading me to a small sofa. Though I noticed Dad isn't included. Edward is preparing for tomorrow's board meeting, Victoria replied smoothly. His presence would complicate tonight's discussion, which is a diplomatic way of saying we're planning the future of Harrington Financial without him, Eleanor interjected, never one to mince words. After nearly driving it off a cliff, he's forfeited his right to navigate the recovery. Blake looked between his mother and grandmother. So this is a coup? This is a rescue operation, Victoria corrected. And unlike your father's secretive maneuvering, we're being transparent about our intentions and including all relevant parties. She nodded in my direction, acknowledging my presence in a way she never had before. Then let's be completely transparent, Blake said firmly. I know about Eliza's control of our mortgage through Ashcroft International. I know about Dad's financial mismanagement and the company's precarious position. What I don't know is exactly what you're proposing as a solution. Victoria exchanged glances with Eleanor, who nodded slightly. We're proposing a complete restructuring, Victoria began. Harrington Financial would be streamlined, refocused on core competencies with an emphasis on the sustainable investment approaches you've been advocating. You would assume leadership with Eleanor and me maintaining board positions, but ceding operational control. And the estate mortgage? Blake asked. That's where Eliza comes in, Eleanor said, turning her penetrating gaze on me. We're proposing a renegotiation of terms that would allow the family to maintain ownership while implementing proper financial controls. In exchange for what? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. A formal role for you in the company, Victoria confirmed. Your financial acumen would be an asset in the restructuring process. And, she added with the faintest hint of irony, it would help integrate you into the family business in a way that acknowledges your unique qualifications. So you're offering to accept me not because I'm marrying Blake, but because I control your mortgage and have skills you need, I summarized. Eleanor laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. Direct as always. Yes, that's essentially correct, though I'd argue that the acceptance was inevitable regardless. You've proven more formidable than Victoria anticipated. Victoria shot her mother-in-law an exasperated look before turning back to me. What matters is that we find a path forward that serves everyone's interests. Blake gets the opportunity to reshape the company according to his vision. The family maintains its core assets and reputation, and you gain a legitimate role commensurate with your abilities rather than operating from the shadows. And what about Edward? Blake asked quietly. What happens to my father in this new arrangement? A brief silence fell over the room. It was Eleanor who finally answered. Edward will be offered a dignified exit, a consulting position with no actual authority, a seat on the charitable foundation board, and public acknowledgement of his decades of service to the company. Behind closed doors, he'll sign agreements restricting his ability to make financial decisions on behalf of either the family or the business. The clinical precision of these terms made it clear that they had been thoroughly discussed before our arrival. I glanced at Blake, wondering how he was processing this ruthless sidelining of his father. He broke your trust, I said softly, for his ears only. But he's still your father. Blake nodded almost imperceptibly before addressing the room. I'll agree to assume leadership of Harrington Financial, but on my terms. The company will be restructured around ethical investment principles, with transparency and sustainability as core values. No more hidden leverage, no more financial shell games. Victoria seemed to struggle with this for a moment before nodding her agreement. Your father won't accept those changes easily. Dad lost the right to dictate terms when he gambled with our family's future without consultation or consent, Blake said, a new firmness in his voice that I'd rarely heard before. He'll accept the dignified exit you've outlined or face the public consequences of his actions. Those are his choices. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with something like pride. And what of your fiancé's role in this new order? She asked. Blake turned to me. That's for Eliza to decide. She's earned the right to define her own position, both personally and professionally. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me expectantly. In that moment, I realized that what had begun as Victoria's attempt to exclude me from her family had transformed into something none of us could have predicted. A seat at the table, offered not grudgingly but out of genuine recognition of what I could contribute. I'll renegotiate the mortgage terms through Ashcroft International, I said, making my decision. The estate will remain in Harrington hands, with a sustainable payment structure. As for my professional role, I'll serve as a financial advisor during the transition, but I won't take a permanent position at Harrington Financial. This last part clearly surprised them all, Blake included. You're declining a formal role? Victoria asked. I believe in Blake's vision for the company, I explained. But I have my own career, my own financial interests. A marriage succeeds when both partners maintain their independence while supporting each other's goals. I turned to Blake. I'll help you rebuild Harrington Financial, but not as an employee, as your partner. A slow smile spread across his face as he understood what I was offering. Support without submission, partnership without absorption. Into the Harrington machine. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. The details took hours to hash out. Financial arrangements, legal considerations, the careful choreography of tomorrow's board meeting, and the public narrative that would follow. Through it all, I watched a new dynamic form within the Harrington family. Blake asserting his vision with confidence, Victoria adapting with surprising flexibility, Eleanor offering wisdom without attempting to control the outcome. It was nearly midnight when we finally concluded, the broad strokes of a new beginning taking shape from the ashes of Edward's financial misadventures. As Blake and I prepared to leave, Victoria approached me while he was engaged in a final conversation with Eleanor. "You're not what I expected when Blake first brought you home," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "I'm better." To my surprise, a genuine smile touched Victoria's lips. "Yes," she admitted, "you are." 6 months later, Blake and I stood together on the terrace of the Harrington estate, watching guests arrive for our wedding. The September evening was perfect, crisp air, leaves just beginning to turn, the grounds immaculate under a canopy of market lights. Harrington Financial was thriving under Blake's leadership, its new focus on sustainable investments attracting clients who valued purpose alongside profit. Edward had accepted his diminished role with resignation, if not grace, his public image carefully maintained even as his private authority was systematically dismantled, and Victoria had surprised everyone by embracing her new position as strategic advisor rather than family autocrat, her shrewd business sense finally finding appropriate expression. "Having second thoughts?" Blake asked, noticing my contemplative mood. "Not one," I assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Just appreciating the journey that brought us here. From you'll never be part of this family to mother-in-law in 6 months, he mused. You have to admit it's not the conventional path to matrimony. I laughed, remembering Victoria's cutting words at our engagement party, now rendered ironic by the current reality. Nothing about us has ever been conventional. And that, Blake said, pressing a kiss to my temple, is precisely why we work. As we turned to join our guests, I caught sight of Victoria directing the final touches for the ceremony. She glanced up, meeting my gaze across the lawn, and inclined her head in the smallest acknowledgement. I smiled in return, savoring the quiet victory. Victoria had declared I would never be part of her family, not knowing that I already controlled the mortgage to their sprawling family estate. Now, ironically, I was joining the family officially, but on my own terms, respected not for conforming to Harrington traditions, but for having the strength to challenge them. In the end, it wasn't my financial leverage that had transformed my relationship with the Harringtons. It was the revelation that legacies survive not through rigid adherence to the past, but through thoughtful evolution toward the future. And that was a lesson worth the struggle it had taken to learn, for all of us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.